I'm Miranda Hayes, 32 years old, and secretly the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech company. No one in my family knows. To them, I'm the struggling daughter who never quite figured it out. They believe that because I don't wear designer labels or drive anything flashy. But truthfully, I never needed to show off. I built everything quietly, intentionally, and tonight, that decision is about to come full circle. It's my father's 60th birthday, a massive, over-the-top celebration where appearances are treated like currency. I decided to show up in my usual understated style one final time. I wanted to see, one last time, if they could look past the surface. Before I dive into what happened that night, I'll ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated just because of how you looked? If so, you'll understand why this story matters. We weren't always wealthy. My childhood was grounded in a modest 3-bedroom home in a middle-class Portland neighborhood. Back then, my dad ran a small manufacturing company, working 60-hour weeks to keep it afloat. My mom stayed home with my older sister Heather and me, carefully budgeting every dollar. We weren't poor, but there was no extravagance, Sunday dinners, board games, and a belief that who you were mattered more than what you had. That belief disappeared when I was 15. Dad landed a major contract and almost overnight, we moved into a mansion in an upscale neighborhood. With the money came a rapid and unsettling shift in values. The reliable Ford in the driveway got swapped for a luxury car. Intimate family dinners turned into curated events meant to impress people. But the most dramatic change came from Heather. 2 years older than me, she dove into our new lifestyle without hesitation. She ditched her old friends, traded her wardrobe for designer everything, and made sure everyone knew how important appearances were. She used to give me lectures about how wealth wasn't just something you had, it was something you needed to display. My mom never challenged that logic. Instead, she rewarded it. She encouraged Heather's social climbing and gently tried to steer me toward the same path, always hinting that I should try a little harder with my appearance or make friends with the right people. In our house, the right people were always the richest ones. While they clung to their shiny new world, I grew more distant. I didn't recognize the people I lived with anymore. When I left for college, I felt a sense of relief. My parents were disappointed that I chose a state university over the elite school they preferred. My dad told me I was wasting an opportunity. What he didn't understand was that I was finally following what made sense to me. Computers never judged me for how I dressed or who I knew. They either worked, or they didn't. College wasn't easy. I juggled multiple jobs and spent most nights coding until sunrise. My family mistook my exhaustion during weekend visits as proof that I was floundering. They had no idea I was quietly building something that would change everything. In my junior year, I developed a neural interface algorithm that caught the attention of a few professors. With their encouragement, I entered a national tech competition and won. That prize money became the foundation of what would become Neurasync Technologies. I started the company in the spare bedroom of my apartment. Glamorous? Not even close. I lived on instant noodles and stretched every penny to afford server space. During our rare video calls, Heather would still mock my old jeans and ask if I knew clothes came in seasons. They didn't see the trajectory. Neurasync grew fast. 5 years in, we had 300 employees and a valuation pushing $2 billion. And still, I told them nothing. At first, I didn't share my success because I knew they'd minimize it. Later, it became something else. I wanted to see if they'd ever treat me with respect without knowing what I'd built. The irony? 6 months ago, my father's company started falling apart. He was desperate for investors. What he didn't know was that Neurasync acquired his business through a shell corporation, my decision, approved by the board. I became his boss, and he had no idea. Every Sunday, I still showed up for family dinner. It had become routine theater. Dad would brag about old connections. Mom would flaunt her new purchases. Heather would show up in something straight from a runway with a new boyfriend who looked straight from a catalog. And I became the silent target of their snide little comments. Heather loved calling my outfits practical with just enough of a sneer to make it sting. My mom would push makeovers. My dad offered to help me upgrade my car. Week after week, they made it clear I didn't belong in the world they had built. Then came the announcement of my dad's birthday celebration. He called it the networking event of the year. The invitation arrived embossed and gilded, demanding formal attire, excellence expected. Heather texted separately, urging me to wear something appropriate because everyone who matters would be there. I sat in my corner office, high above the Seattle skyline, and made my choice. I wasn't going to play along anymore. The morning of the party was perfect. Sunlight poured through the windows of my downtown penthouse, casting warmth across the space I'd curated with intention. Everything inside was elegant, functional, and honest. No excess. Just quality. As I sipped my coffee on the balcony, the irony wasn't lost on me. Most of tonight's guests could barely afford to lease the car I parked in, let alone afford the life I quietly built. Yet I was still the unsuccessful daughter in their eyes. Stephanie, my COO and best friend since college, texted to check in. She was ready to bail me out with a rescue call if things went sideways. I appreciated her for that. She reminded me that I was the one who deserved their approval, not the other way around. I picked out my outfit with care. Dark jeans, a silk blouse, a tailored blazer. Classic. Polished. No logos. No distractions. My grandmother's pearl earrings were my only accessory. They grounded me. They reminded me of a time before image became everything. Just before leaving, I got a call from Richard Thompson, one of our key investors and, coincidentally, the same man my father had been chasing for a year. He casually mentioned attending a birthday party for someone named Lawrence Hayes and asked if that was my father. I confirmed it with a quiet laugh. What were the chances? He joked about discussing our integration plans at the event, but once I explained the situation with my family, he was stunned. When I told him they had no idea who I really was, his laugh boomed through the phone. He promised to play along if he saw me there, but gently reminded me that I should never have to hide my success, especially not from family. After that call, I sat for a while, reflecting on everything. I had saved my father's company. I had built something world-changing. And still, I was showing up to a party where I'd be judged the second I stepped out of my car. And I was right. When I pulled up in my understated Audi, the valet's reaction said it all. Surprise, barely concealed. As if I was at the wrong event. And that was just the beginning. At the far end, my father stood on stage with a microphone. And I want to thank all of you for contributing to Hayes Manufacturing's success, he was saying. We've faced challenges, but with associates like you. His gaze landed on us. His voice trailed off. He descended from the stage quickly. Miranda, he began, his tone clipped. I thought we agreed. Then he noticed Richard. Mr. Thompson. What a surprise. I didn't know you'd met my daughter. Richard smiled. Lawrence, I didn't know your daughter was the CEO of Neurosync. You've been holding out on me. You could hear the collective intake of breath from the crowd. Even the string quartet had paused. My father's face twisted in confusion. Miranda works in computers, yes. But she's not. She most certainly is, Richard cut in, voice calm but commanding. CEO and board chair. Neurosync Technologies. Current valuation, over $2 billion. The murmur that followed confirmed it. People knew the name. They just hadn't known it was mine. My father turned to me, pale. Is this true? Yes, I said, steady now. I founded Neurosync 8 years ago. All these years, and you never told us? Because you never asked, I said simply. You assumed. My mother and Heather had pushed to the front. My mother's hand was to her mouth. Heather looked like she might faint. There's more, Richard said. Neurosync recently acquired a promising company, Hayes Manufacturing. A smart investment, but one in need of modern leadership. My father's face drained of color. "You bought my company?" he whispered. "We acquired it, quietly, fairly. You'll see the announcement next week." The realization struck like a thunderclap. The daughter who had been dismissed for wearing jeans had just saved the company they'd been bragging about all night. Richard turned to the room. "Perhaps this is a reminder to look beyond appearances. I've worked with Miranda for years. Her intelligence, integrity, and vision are what define her, not her wardrobe." My father looked stricken. My mother was crying. Heather still hadn't moved. "Miranda," my father said finally. "Why didn't you tell us? Would it have changed anything?" I asked gently. "Would you have stopped mocking my car? My clothes? Would Heather have stopped calling me a disappointment?" No one responded. "Success isn't about what you wear," I said. "It's about impact. About how you treat people." Richard added, "Without Neurosync's intervention, your company would have closed in 3 months." There was no denying it now. No rewriting the story. And then, softly, my father said, I'm proud of you." Too late. But still. "Thank you," I replied. "But I'm the same person I was an hour ago, just now, you see me differently." And that, finally, gave them something real to think about. The moment I stepped out of the car, I knew what was coming. Heather was stationed at the entrance like a glamorous gatekeeper, dressed to kill and holding a clipboard like she was coordinating a royal gala. The second she saw me, her smile froze. Her eyes scanned me from head to toe, and I could practically hear the calculations happening in her head: blazer, jeans, no designer label in sight. To her, I may as well have shown up in sweatpants. She pulled me aside before I could even reach the check-in table. Without saying it outright, she made it clear I looked out of place and was on the verge of embarrassing the family. I didn't flinch. I told her I wasn't changing. Either they welcomed me as I was, or I'd leave. That's when my father showed up. His jaw tightened when he saw me, then he glanced around at the guests milling about the entrance. I could see it in his eyes. He was weighing the social cost of letting me through the doors dressed the way I was. Image over everything. In the end, that calculation won. He said it was his event, his rules, and that I knew what was expected in this family. I'd prepared myself for rejection, but it still hurt. Deeply. My own father was turning me away from his birthday celebration, not because I caused a scene, not because I was rude, but because my clothes didn't scream wealth loudly enough for his comfort. I held my head high, wished him a happy birthday, and turned to leave. I could feel everyone watching, their stares burning into my back. He called after me, maybe realizing he'd gone too far, but Heather was already leading him back toward the party, whispering in his ear that they were doing the right thing. I didn't leave the venue, though. I couldn't. Something in me refused to run. I didn't build a billion-dollar company by shrinking in moments like this. Instead, I walked around the side of the building to a garden terrace, quiet, dimly lit, and mostly empty. I found a bench tucked behind a row of ornamental shrubs and sat down, pulling out my phone like it was armor. Work had always been my refuge. It didn't care about appearances. Technology is beautifully indifferent, it either works or it doesn't. As I sifted through emails from my dev team about our latest neural interface prototype, I couldn't help but notice the irony. There I was, locked out of a party thrown by the very man whose company I had just saved, finalizing the technical details of that very rescue. Beneath the calm I tried to maintain, a storm brewed. I felt anger, betrayal, hurt, but also a strange sense of anticipation. Would the truth even matter to them? Would they care that the woman they had labeled unsuccessful had quietly become the person holding the future of Hayes manufacturing in her hands? That question gnawed at me. For years, I told myself that I kept my success hidden to avoid feeding into their materialism. But that night, in the quiet of that garden, I had to admit something harder. I wanted them to value me for who I was. I wanted their respect without having to dress it up in designer clothes or flashy cars. The answer had arrived loud and clear. As I sat there, the sounds of the party filtered through the garden, polished laughter, orchestral music, the clink of champagne flutes. It was a world I had been deemed unworthy to enter, despite being the one who had made it possible for that world to still exist. Then I heard footsteps on the gravel path. When I looked up, I was surprised to see Richard Thompson walking toward me. He looked as he always did, simple dark suit, no flashy accessories, completely confident in his own skin. I stood to greet him, and his reaction caught me off guard. He gave me a slight, respectful bow and addressed me with my formal title. The contrast between how he treated me and how my own family had just dismissed me hit like a wave. I told him to just call me Miranda, and he asked, genuinely confused, why I was sitting out here alone instead of enjoying the party. So I told him what happened at the door. As I explained how I had been turned away for looking too poor, his disbelief grew. I reminded him that the acquisition hadn't been made public yet, so my family still had no idea I was the CEO of Neurasync. He couldn't believe it. The chairman of one of the most innovative tech companies in the country, barred from her own father's event because her clothes weren't expensive enough. It was absurd. He said so, with a level of frustration that felt oddly comforting. He shared that he'd been trying to get a meeting with my father for months, considering investing before learning we had acquired the company. I told him, dryly, that my father's always eager to mention Richard at dinner. What he didn't know was that Richard and I had been working together for years, and in many of those ventures, I was technically his superior. Richard asked me why I never told them the truth. Why I never used my position to demand their respect. I told him I'd hoped they might respect me without it. That maybe I was naive for wanting that. But he shook his head and told me it wasn't naivety, it was principle. That same principle, he said, was what made me a good CEO. He stood, straightened his jacket, and made it clear he didn't come all the way out here just to let that kind of treatment slide. He said it was time to remind a few people that substance matters more than status. I hesitated, but he shared a story about how early in his career, a receptionist once assumed he was a delivery man because he arrived on public transit. 2 years later, he bought the company, and ended up promoting that same receptionist once she stopped judging people by appearances. He extended his arm and asked if I was ready to go back in. I nodded. As we walked back toward the entrance, I could feel everything shifting. The moment wasn't just personal anymore. It was something larger. I was done hiding. Whatever happened next would change everything, permanently. Heather was still at the entrance when we returned, surrounded by a small crowd of my father's business associates. Her laughter died the second she saw me approaching with Richard. Her expression twisted through surprise, calculation, and then something close to panic. One of the businessmen next to her murmured something about Richard, clearly recognizing him. Heather tried to mask her confusion with a bright smile, acting as if nothing unusual had happened earlier. She welcomed Richard like an honored guest, completely ignoring me. Richard responded politely but firmly, mentioning that he had just been having a conversation with me, his business associate, in the garden. Heather's expression flickered again. When he addressed me as Madam Chairman, I saw the gears turning in her head. The title landed like a thunderclap. We walked past her and into the ballroom together, and I could feel the room change. My father was on stage, in the middle of a speech, thanking everyone for their support. He spotted us almost immediately. His words faltered. A ripple of confusion moved through the guests as they turned to see why. We walked toward him. Richard nodded at people as we passed, while I stayed silent. Each step toward that stage felt like a line being crossed, one I could never uncross. By the time we reached the front, my father had stepped down from the stage. He looked between us, clearly struggling to make sense of what was happening. He started to say something, but then saw Richard beside me. I watched the moment it clicked. Richard casually mentioned that he hadn't realized my father's daughter was the CEO of Neurasync. The surrounding guests, now silent, processed what he'd just said. My father's face went pale. He tried to laugh it off, saying I just worked with computers. That's when Richard clarified that I wasn't just an employee, I was the founder, CEO, and board chair of Neurasync Technologies. And yes, it was currently valued at over $2 billion. There was no room left to deny it. I confirmed it simply. Told my father I'd started the company 8 years ago. That it had grown quietly. And yes, I let them all believe I was struggling. Because I wanted to know if I could ever matter to them without money. The crowd around us grew. My mother and Heather pushed their way forward, both wearing stunned expressions. That's when Richard added the final twist. He explained that Neurasync had recently acquired a manufacturing company. A struggling one. My father finally pieced it together. He whispered the name, Hayes Manufacturing. I nodded. We'd purchased it through a shell corporation. The acquisition would be made public next week. It was strictly business, I told him. His company had good bones, just outdated leadership. Everyone around us stood in stunned silence. The daughter who had been dismissed and underestimated had saved the family legacy without saying a word. Richard turned to the guests and spoke plainly. Maybe this was a reminder to look beyond appearances. That not all value comes wrapped in status symbols. I watched my father absorb it all. He looked at me like he was seeing a stranger and someone familiar all at once. And suddenly, I didn't need his approval anymore. But I could see he finally wanted to give it. Heather tried to pull me back into the party's social whirlwind, but I stopped her. I told her she didn't need to do this, that I was still just her sister. For a moment, the perfect mask she wore cracked, but then she reminded me, without saying it directly, that now I was important. I quietly told her I had always been important, that was the whole point she had missed all along. After extricating myself from her attempts to insert me into the networking circuit, my father cornered me in a small side room off the ballroom. He closed the door halfway, as if to create some illusion of privacy. His tone was subdued, unlike the usual commanding voice I knew so well. He said we needed to talk. I agreed. He paced the room, clearly struggling to find the words. He asked why I had never told him the truth, why I let them believe I was struggling for all those years. I told him the honest reason: I wanted to be valued for who I am, not for what I own or have achieved. But I reminded him that family was supposed to be about unconditional support and love, not judgment about clothes, cars, or lifestyles. That was when I saw a flicker of embarrassment in his eyes. He insisted they weren't mocking me, that they were only concerned and wanted me to present myself better. I challenged him on that. Was that really concern, or fear of embarrassment caused by me not fitting their image? He had no answer for that. Right then, Richard Thompson walked in. He seemed to sense the tension and gently interrupted, steering us back to business and the transition plan for Hayes Manufacturing. My father immediately switched gears, slipping into professional mode. He accepted Richard's presence and spoke with a mix of awkwardness and reluctant respect. My father looked between us, the reality sinking in. I was truly his boss now. It was clear this reversal of power pained him deeply. Richard reassured him, explaining he'd been following my work for years, commending the company I built from scratch. He framed the acquisition not as a failure, but as an evolution. My father seemed to take comfort in that perspective. He even apologized for his earlier harshness at the entrance, a rare admission for a man who seldom apologized. I thanked him simply, knowing how much it must have cost him. When we returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Guests who had witnessed the confrontation looked on with open curiosity. My mother approached, anxiety etched on her face, asking if everything was all right. I told her honestly that we were working on it. She clasped my hands, apologizing for the years she'd spent criticizing my appearance and career. She confessed she thought she was helping me by trying to make me more like Heather. Her candor surprised me. Of all my family members, I least expected my mother to so openly admit her mistakes. I told her it would take time for all of us to adjust. The rest of the evening blurred between business networking and fragile family healing. I noticed my father responding to questions about me with a mix of pride and disbelief, awkwardly introducing me as my daughter, the CEO. Heather, meanwhile, was still pushing her performance of excessive supportiveness. But the cracks were visible beneath her polished surface. Later, I found her alone on the terrace, holding a nearly empty champagne flute. She confessed that she'd spent her entire adult life chasing approval through the right clothes, the right car, and the right social connections. Meanwhile, I had ignored all those signals, and now, ironically, I was the one everyone admired. I told her success wasn't a competition, but in our family, everything had been exactly that. Heather laughed bitterly, admitting she had never thought of it that way. Despite the bitter undertones, I reassured her I was still just Miranda, unchanged at my core. She gave me a sideways look, acknowledging silently that, yes, everything had changed. As the party wound down, I sat with a swirl of emotions, vindication, sadness, and uncertainty. Was their respect real, or just another performance? Had I really changed their values, or simply met their materialistic standards? That question lingered as Richard came to say goodnight. He complimented me on how I'd handled the evening with grace, something not everyone would manage after such public rejection. I thanked him, suspecting he'd enjoyed the drama more than he let on. He told me my father would come around, though it might take time for his pride to recover. I hoped so, and meant it. Before I left, my father approached one last time. He asked if I was staying for the rest of the party. I explained I had an early meeting the next day. He nodded and hesitated, then asked if I'd still come to family dinner tomorrow night. His question caught me off guard. Did he really want me there? I asked him if he wanted me to come, especially in the clothes I was wearing. He admitted with embarrassment that he did, he still had a lot to learn. I told him I'd be there. 3 months later, sitting in my Neurosync office overlooking the Seattle skyline, I reflected on how much had changed. The acquisition was complete. My father now reported to the board I chaired. The transition hadn't been easy. For a man used to complete autonomy, corporate oversight was a bitter pill. We'd had arguments, tense meetings, and one memorable episode when he stormed out, refusing to take orders from his own daughter. But slowly, he began to see the value in innovation. Productivity and profit margins at Hayes Manufacturing had improved. More importantly, he was starting to grasp that substance mattered more than appearance, in business and family. Family dinners resumed, though early ones were awkward. My mother tried too hard, asking technical questions she didn't understand. Heather swung between jealousy and forced admiration. My father looked lost, unsure how to balance the dual roles of dad and subordinate. Yet week by week, meal by meal, a new dynamic was emerging. Imperfect, fraught with tension, but more honest than before. One day, a business associate stopped by our table and complimented my casual attire. To my shock, my father immediately defended me, explaining that I dressed for comfort and practicality, and that my success meant I didn't need to prove anything with clothes. That small moment was tangible proof he was beginning to understand. Heather's transformation was more complicated. She initially swung to the other extreme, showing up in jeans and a plain sweater, an overcorrection that looked as unnatural on her as a ball gown would on me. I told her she didn't need to change who she was or abandon the things she enjoyed, like fashion and beauty. The problem was judging others by those standards. She seemed surprised but thoughtful. Later, she even asked for advice on a sustainable fashion boutique she was considering starting. My mother, too, had her own awakening. She admitted she'd always felt like an outsider in the family's wealthy world. Following the unwritten rules of appearances had been her way to avoid being seen as an imposter. I shared with her how, in tech, I was often the only woman in a room full of men who assumed I didn't belong. That conversation deepened our bond. Then my assistant reminded me of dinner at my parents' house. Heather had news, apparently her boyfriend had just proposed. I arrived in my usual jeans and simple top. My father opened the door and greeted me with a genuine hug, telling me everyone was in the living room. He whispered that he was proud of me, not because of my company or success, but because of who I was, my integrity. It wasn't perfect, and our relationship would always have its complications, but in that moment, I finally felt what I'd been seeking for years: acceptance. Not for what I owned or achieved, but for who I truly was. True worth, I'd learned, never comes from labels or possessions. It comes from living authentically, creating value, and having the courage to be yourself, even when others judge you for it. As I joined my family in the living room that night, I knew one thing for sure. No designer label or flashy car could ever match the value of being truly seen.